Yes.
This meeting is being recorded.
There's that loud notification. Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. My name is Annie Carter. I am the program coordinator at Colorado Canyons Association. I'm sure most of you in attendance are already familiar with what we do. We engage the local communities through outreach, education, and stewardship on our 3 national conservation areas here in Western Colorado. We have McInnis Canyons, which is in Fruta, Dominquez-Escalante, down kind of around Delta, and then the Gunnison Gorge. We're so lucky to have those 3 national conservation areas basically in our backyard for so many of us. And joining us tonight is Zebulon Miracle, who is also probably a familiar name to a lot of you. Local history buff, former CCA board member, and I am so excited to hear what he has to share with us tonight. When he gave me the options for tonight's talk when we were planning this months ago, I quickly jumped on the murder and mayhem in the NCAs. So I love a good murder mystery. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Zeb. Please put all your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'll be reading over those. We'll have time for questions at the end. And so you can have all your questions answered.
Well, they'll be answered. I don't know if they'll be answered truthfully or correctly. Yes, I gladly at least take questions and pretend like I'm giving you the correct answer. Thank you all for joining. Really do appreciate it. I was really thrilled when Annie reached out asking if I'd be interested in participating. And I always am. And as she mentioned, we're very fortunate to have not 1, not 2, but 3 national conservation areas right here in our backyard. And so tonight, I would like to tell you about some of the more seedy, interesting history to happen in these areas. These are very, very big plots of land. There's a lot of human history that takes place in our NCAs. I'm not going to be able to tell you every single story. You should see what I had to leave on the cutting room floor as I was putting this talk together. There's been just a really colorful history to our NCAs. I'm also only going to be able to talk about 2 of them tonight. So I'll be talking about McInnis Canyons and Dominquez-Escalante NCAs. I have looked and looked and looked for a really good story for Gunnison Gorge. And so either Gunnison Gorge is one of the most peaceful places on earth, or I just haven't been able to uncover a good story related to murder and mayhem in that area. So if you come across one, I'm always looking for more stories to add. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and we'll get started. And I'll be speaking for about 45, 50 minutes, leaving plenty of time for questions at the end. All right. Annie, are we sharing screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
All right, good to hear. So as I mentioned, we're going to really focus on 2 of our 3 NCAs tonight. And again, maybe sometime I'll be able to put together a talk on nothing but Gunnison Gorge. But tonight, again, some highlights for me, some favorite stories to tell. We're going to kind of make our way from north to south. And I'll actually confess, I'm going to cheat a little bit. And our first story will actually take place just outside of the NCA, but still one of my favorite areas. On your screen right now, you can see a map of the McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area. And just outside of the NCA, just right on the state line is where our first story takes place. But I'm okay including this story because it's a great story. And also the area that we're going to be talking about is a personal favorite of mine because you can basically see it from Colorado Canyons Association's Catalpa property. If you're not familiar with that program, it is an amazing program, an amazing asset for Colorado Canyons to have for educational programming. And so you can basically see the property that I'm talking about from Catalpa. So when you are at Catalpa, this story basically speaks right to you. But if you'll notice our NCA, if you can see my mouse here, there's the Colorado-Utah state line. You can see the Colorado River running this way. I'm going to show you an early map, or a view, I should say, of this area. Again, this is on the road into the Catalpa property. If you look out here, you see this really steep canyon cliff as the railroad makes a bend. This area is called May Flats. And May Flats was homesteaded by a man by the name of Charles C. Brock. And let me show you this early map of the area. So here you see that bend in the Colorado River. Here you see the Utah-Colorado state line. You can see the railroad right here. And if you look very, very carefully, right here, you can see the property of Charles Brock. Charles Brock has a kind of tragic end to his life, which I'm going to talk about. The gentleman pictured in this photo is not Charles Brock, rather this is Captain W.E. Davis. W.E. Davis was shot in the hip during the Civil War. He made his way out to Western Colorado about 25 years later. Around 1890, he was looking for an area to homestead in the Westwater, Utah area. And Davis meets this man, Charles Brock, and he becomes fascinated with Brock's property and really wants to buy that property. Davis first meets Brock when Brock was in jail for cattle rustling. And as Davis was going to visit Brock in jail, he said, well, you're in jail. I will watch your property and maybe we'll be able to come to an agreement on you actually selling it to me. However, Brock really wasn't interested, or at least no deal was actually formally met. So instead, Davis and Brock would oftentimes work together. They'd oftentimes work on ranch chores back and forth with each other. They were neighbors, and they both employed the same two gentlemen at one time. One man was named Charles Dussel, and the other was William Mueller. Now, Dussel and Mueller worked for Davis, and then they would on occasion go up and work for Brock. And one day in 1890, Davis got really upset with the two, and he fired them. And so Brock then said, well, you guys can still come and work for me. And right about that time, tensions really started to rise between Davis and Brock. Fast forward to 1892, August of 1892, Davis goes out to his field and he sees some fence posts that were burnt. He also notices some of his honey was missing. And right away, Davis suspects that Brock, along with the two gentlemen that he had fired that are now working for Brock, Dussel and Mueller, were responsible for not just the theft, but also the property damage. Davis then goes to another neighbor of his, a man by the name of Grant, and he enlists Grant's help to go out and to spy on Brock and Dussel and Mueller. So here you have these two gentlemen. Pictured here in this is that Captain Davis and his friend Grant sneak up about a mile away, probably about where that photo was taken that I showed you. And they use a spyglass and they start looking at the Brock cabin. And they're wanting to see, like, what are they up to? What are they planning? Can we actually see if they have our honey? Can we see what's going on here? Eventually the day gets a little long, day gets a little late. Grant and Davis go back to Davis's cabin for dinner. Grant ends up sleeping there for the night. And the next morning, on August 25th, 1892, they make their way to the Brock Ranch. Now, Davis is carrying with him a .44 Colt revolver. Grant has a .44 Winchester rifle. And as they approach Brock's cabin, they decide to stash the Winchester rifle. Davis maybe was willing to go in rather aggressive, but he was fairly generous to his friend Grant, not wanting to get him in over his head. So Davis and Grant start sneaking up to the cabin, and they overhear Brock and Mueller and Dussel discussing leaving the state. And Davis decides this is our one chance. If we're going to find out what's going on, we need to strike now. So the two of them sit and they watch. And they see Brock go out and gather his horse, and he starts taking off. And he's heading to his pasture to gather the rest of his horses. That leaves just Dussel and Mueller back at the cabin. Davis decides, well, here's our chance. Here's our chance to go up and see what's actually going on. Now that Brock's gone, I can talk to my two former employees. I can talk to these two other gentlemen and see what's going on. So Dussel is outside in front of the cabin. He's tending to a fire. He has a club with him, and he's just watching this fire, not really noticing what's happening. Captain Davis goes up to the cabin where Mueller's inside getting dressed. Davis tries to convince Mueller to come out and have a conversation, but Mueller refuses. He's like, no, I'm not getting involved with this. Dussel then comes over and confronts Davis and asks what's going on. Some harsh words were said, and Dussel takes his club and he swings at Davis twice. Davis then fires a warning shot into the air. That startles Mueller, who takes his rifle and fires from inside of his cabin. The shot misses Davis, but right away that puts Davis on edge. So he turns his pistol and he shoots Dussel in the face, killing him instantly. Davis then rushes to the cabin where Mueller is at. And before Mueller can get a clean shot out, Davis fires twice. Miraculously, Mueller ends up living, but only for another 24 hours. Grant, who has been sitting back, watches all this going on. He rushes up to the cabin and he hears Davis saying, "My God, this is awful." And the two start to leave. But on their way back to Westwater, Davis and Grant pass by Brock's pasture. Remember, Brock wasn't very far away at all. And along the trail, Davis and Grant meet Brock in the trail. And they start to exchange words. Davis gets between Brock and the cabin to block his way, and Brock decides to charge at Davis, saying this is a threat, and he shoots at him twice. Both shots miss. Or excuse me, pardon me, I said that wrong. Davis gets between Brock and the cabin. Brock charges, and Davis shoots twice. Davis and when the shots kill him, Davis and Grant go back to Westwater to send news to Grand Junction about what had happened. And in one of the most famous telegrams ever sent in Grand Junction history, Davis sends this telegram: "For very good reason, I ran into Brock in his outfit at 6 o'clock this morning. And as a result, I want 3 plain, cheap coffins soon as possible." Davis then turns himself in to the sheriff in Moab. They do a quick coroner's jury and they actually acquit him. But Davis, his reputation kind of precedes him. Davis wasn't exactly a saint. And eventually word gets out to some people higher up in Salt Lake City about what had happened. And even though the Moab coroner's jury decided not to try him, the state of Utah decides that no, we actually do need to do a trial. Davis had actually taken the boots off of the dead men to use as evidence to show that it was indeed their boots that he found on his property the day before. They even find honey at Brock's ranch. So maybe there's a little bit of cause to this, or maybe a little bit of reason behind it, but is stealing honey and burning some fences enough to murder 3 people or kill 3 people? That ended up being a question for the jury. They even exhumed Brock's body. After the 3 men were shot, they did a quick burial at Brock's ranch, and they did a quick burial at the time of the shooting. In December of 1892, they ended up digging up Brock's body to examine how the bullet entered his skull to see if Davis's story was true or not. They ended up finding Davis guilty on voluntary manslaughter, and he ended up serving 8 months in jail in Grand County. So really not a terrible amount of time for killing 3 people. Davis then moves to Long Beach, California, but some suspicious fires happened. There was some real shady business dealings, and people started looking into Davis a little bit more, and eventually in 1914, he was convicted of first-degree murder for one of his business partners. And that is usually where we end that story. But just the other day, I came across this newspaper article from the Daily Sentinel from 1914. This is just before Davis's trial in Los Angeles. And this January 29th, 1914 newspaper article says that Captain W.E. Davis, murderer of 3 men near Westwater in 1892, is now awaiting trial for murder in Los Angeles and has confessed to the triple killing near this city: the murder of Charles Brock, Adolf Mueller and August Dussel, is well remembered by the early settlers of Mesa County. In his confession to the LA police, Davis admits what many local people contended for a long time, namely that Brock, Mueller, and Dussel were murdered from ambush. They were known as harmless Germans who, well, might have indulged in the common practice of cattle stealing, did a little ranching near the Utah line. Davis was afraid they were going to give him away, for he was said to be rustling in wholesale fashion. And he came on Mueller and Dussel in their cabin, shot them both, and as Brock rode him, killed him also. Davis had a bad reputation all over the Western Slope, although his wife was generally beloved for her many charming traits. And I think this is fascinating to come across an article like this. It really kind of changes the story later. 16 years later, we go from this almost historic figure sitting the iconic Sin 3 cheap coffins, and that the Brock gang was such a bad gang that they just deserved a cheap burial. It now changes in his confession, in Davis's confession, that maybe there was more to this murder. Remember, prior to reading Davis's confession, the only thing we knew about that day came from Davis's account and a little bit of Grant's account. So one of my favorite things, one of my favorite concepts when I discuss history is this idea that our view of history changes. And so this is yet another rabbit hole for me to go down. This confession, again, kind of changes the story quite a bit. It changes how we tell the story. And it also changes maybe who the heroes and who the villains are. So history is never quite as simple or cut and dry as it appears. So although this happens just barely outside of the National Conservation Area, I have no doubt that these gentlemen were traveling up and down that corridor. I have no doubt next time you go to Catalpa, you'll be standing on the same path that all three of our characters in this story must have taken at some point. Let's move on. A lot of other stories to tell. We talk quite a bit about sheep, or talk a lot about cattle. In that article, we were talking about how they're maybe taking part in just a little bit of cattle rustling versus Davis taking part in wholesale cattle stealing. And that's quite a common story that we're going to be talking about tonight. Agriculture has always been Mesa County's #1 industry, and that comes in terms of both fruit and the wonderful produce that we create out in places like Palisade, but also ranching, when you include that in agriculture, is just massive. We have so much free range out here. We have so much land that's great for ranching. A lot of our NCAs are still used for ranching. A lot of great cowboy stories out here, a lot of great stories from urban ranchers. This is one of my favorite photos. Yes, it's outside of one of our NCAs. This is actually just outside of Telluride, but it looks like something straight out of Hollywood, doesn't it? And this is truly not just our past history, but in a lot of ways our contemporary history as well. Ranching is still extremely important for our community today. And again, our NCAs play a major role in that. But when we talk about ranching, oftentimes we kind of make the mistake of only talking about cattle ranching. There's a lot of sheep herding out here as well. This, as many of you will be able to recognize, is a photograph taken in the McInnis Canyons NCA. You can see a nice open field here. You can see some of our canyon country behind. A lot of folks don't really understand or remember or realize, I should say, that this area was also prime sheep country, especially in the McInnis Canyons NCA. So I'm going to show you a photo from the early 1930s, basically taken at the same spot with thousands of sheep grazing out in what's now the front country of the McInnis Canyons NCA. We had many sheep in this area. One of the most famous sheep herders is this gentleman. This is Will Miner. If you're not familiar with Will Miner, I highly encourage you to look more into to Mr. Miner. Will Miner was a photographer. I'll be showing you a couple of photos that Miner took. He was also a great author and just wrote really compelling, beautiful accounts of what life was like as a sheep herder and working out in what's now the McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area. long before there were trails for recreation. This is back in the time when these trails were used for ranching almost exclusively. The thought of going that far out in the middle of nowhere past any type of development was quite exotic for many people. And so when Miner wrote these articles and they would appear in the Daily Sentinel, he was really opening up a new world to people. But Miner writes a lot about running sheep in the area. You can see a sheep here. This is actually in Devil's Canyon, perched very precariously on this canyon cliff. This is a part of the Devil's Canyon area known as the High Trail. It's not an official trail, but you can still see the trail in place in areas. And Will Miner had this to write about the High Trail. And just look at all the sheep clinging to the side of this canyon wall as I read this. Miner wrote, "High on the face of the towering red sandstone cliffs, there runs a broken, narrow, shelf-like ledge known locally as the High Trail. The ledge varies in width, 10 to 20 feet at its wider places, less than 30 inches at its narrowest. Yet this precarious shelf is a well-traveled road. Amid the rugged canyons which reach out mile after mile to either side, this trail is one of the very few paths over which man and animal may safely move. Most of the canyon walls are perpendicular and impossible for anything except for birds. But over the High Trail, great bands of sheep, herds of white-faced cattle, packers, and camp movers with their strings of loaded pack horses pass on the migrations between the Black Rock country and the lowlands along the Colorado River. To the wild animals of the region, the High Trail is a main highway too. For deer, fox, coyotes, wildcats, rabbits, and a host of smaller creatures regularly use the trail." And so we have this period in time where we have both sheep and cattle grazing in the same places. If you want to read more by Will Miner, and again, I highly encourage you to, you can find his books. They're rather hard to find in the original prints. He wrote 2 books, Footprints in the Trail and More Footprints in the Trail. Finding the original editions are rather difficult, but they've recently republished Footprints in the Trail, and that's far less expensive than the original printing of it. But Miner gives us this view into the life of a sheep herder, and when we talk about Brock and we talk about Davis, it kind of gives you a view into the life of ranching. And I mentioned from about 1881 to 1934, we had sheep and cattle competing on the same lands. And this is land in the McInnis Canyons National Conservation, or what's now the McInnis Canyons NCA, what's now the Dominquez-Escalante National Conservation. And I'm going to bet also within Gunnison Gorge, we had people using whatever rangeland they could. Between 1881, when this area was first opened up for homesteading and grazing, until the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, there was an unofficial rule. It was unofficial but heavily enforced of first in time, first in right. That is, whoever got to the land first were the ones that said that this land is ours to use, if they owned it or not. There were a couple of conflicts to this. Traditionally, ranchers, those running cattle, would have a permanent headquarter or ranch. And those without tended to be sheep herders. Now, that's a very blanket, broad statement. There are exceptions on both sides. But you can see how there starts to be this conflict between ranchers saying, our ranch is here, we own this land, we're using the land all around it for grazing, versus the more migratory sheep herders who are going wherever the grasses are available to them. And this creates quite a bit of conflict until the Taylor Grazing Act is passed. Oftentimes, or I shouldn't say often, I should say sometimes, these conflicts became quite deadly. And this is oftentimes referred to as the sheep and cattle wars. You can see, again, these did become deadly. They became deadly by both the ranchers and also the sheep herders. You can see on the picture on the left an illustration of a flock of sheep being chased off of a cliff. Between 1903 and 1913, it's estimated that 50 sheepmen were murdered in the state of Colorado and about 25,000 sheep ran over cliffs. We also have accounts, though, of sheep herders going and raiding ranches or sneaking up on cowboy camps. This was a very bloody time period. It really wasn't a very friendly period at all. It's interesting reading the different accounts between the Daily Sentinel and the Star Times. The two newspapers oftentimes are at odds for who is right and who is wrong. But things really started to come to a head around 1908, 1909. There's an incident called the Taylor Incident when some 20,000 ewes and lambs from the Taylor camp on the Garfield-Montrose County line were murdered. Again, there was also shootings by sheep herders at cowboys as well, and ranchers as well. So it was a very, very bloody time period. Again, this wasn't really solved until 1934 when Edward T. Taylor, a congressman from the Western Slope, really pushed to pass the Taylor Grazing Act. And what this did is it established grazing districts. And what that did is it created the permit system like what we have today. And the grazing services, which in a roundabout way would go on to become the Bureau of Land Management, was formed. There were different range districts where they started divvying up the range as far as who is where at what time. Now, while this has a very bloody story and bloody past to it, it is quite interesting that at the end, it's one of the first times in American land history that authority to give classification to land use and its best use was really determined by its users. A gentleman by the name of Farrington or Ferry Carpenter was appointed to oversee the Taylor Grazing Act, and he made it a point to meet with stockmen, both sheep herders and cattle ranchers, and really try to come up with a fair, equitable way of divvying up the range. But to get there, prior to 1935, again, it ended up being quite a tumultuous time. And we see that both in the McInnis Canyons NCA, and we also see that especially in Dominquez-Escalante, which we'll talk about here in a second. These are just a couple of quick newspaper clippings from the sheep and cattle wars. You see this one from 1884, Death on the Range, the sad fate of Mr. Reed, who was a cattle grower of Mesa County, found dead in the snow. You have another one from 1893, wholesale slaughter of sheep on the hogback Saturday night. And this one from 1908, Silent Men on the Watch, where a line of cattlemen stood guard as 20,000 sheep passed through at Canna Creek. We could do an entire talk on just the sheep and cattle wars, the range wars. We could do an entire talk on how that's affected land policy today. I kind of want to move this a little bit to something more to home for you and really drive the point of this and tie it into our talk today. This is a map of the front country of the McInnis Canyons National Conservation Area. You can see Devil's Canyon over here. You can see Flume Canyon here. Here is East Pollock and West Pollock. These red areas were homesteaded. That is, the gentleman by the name of John Beard was able to apply for a homestead, and he was able to get that land deeded to him from the federal government. He was able to show that he made improvements on the land. He filed a fee, and he was given this land from the federal government in 1927. And if you look carefully, this is still outside the National Conservation Area today. But here in the mouth of Devils, we can see one of his holdings. This is now part of the NCA. But if you have hiked much in Devil's Canyon, I have no doubt that you have come across one of the areas that John Beard was using for his sheep operations, and that is the famous cabin in Devil's Canyon. I don't have a story of murder or mayhem actually at the cabin itself. Rather, it is a great testament to talk about how both sheep and cattle were used in Devil's Canyon. And to tie it back to Will Miner really quick, I'd like to just read a quick story that Miner has talking about Devil's Canyon and what I believe is most likely this cabin itself, the famous canyon at the end of the Devil's Canyon Trail. Miner writes, I was late in getting the camp moved one day, and it was near midnight when I got back home to the ranch in Devil's Canyon. I did not want to awaken anyone, so I unsaddled my horses, turned them loose, and found a level spot between a pile of lumber and a stack of packed saddles, where I unrolled my sleeping bag and slept soundly until daylight. After breakfast the next morning, the first job of the day was to move that lumber. When the last of the lumber was removed, a medium-sized rattlesnake with 14 rattles was found coiled up underneath the bottom plank, less than an arm's length from where I had been sleeping. Later in the day, when I saddled the pack horses, a second rattler of equal size was found beneath the pack saddles. I must admit that had I known that the rattlers were where I would have taken my bedroll, if I would have known where the rattlers were, then I would have taken my bedroll somewhere else. But sleeping between a pair of rattlesnakes who are minding their own business is certainly far less dangerous than driving on the highway or crossing the street in traffic. Yet people do it every day and think nothing of it. It's all in the point of view. So I again want you to hopefully leave inspired when you take this very famous, very popular, very beautiful hike. And when you make it back to that cabin, keep in mind people like Will Miner, who were out there doing sheep grazing. And Miner at this point, when he came, it was at the end of the sheep and cattle wars and after. But also keep in mind that these canyons were contested territory between the two camps. And our cabin out there tells a testament to it. Many of you have also probably hiked in Codell's Canyon. Codell's Canyon is a little bit farther east. And in Codell's Canyon, if you make it all the way back, and again, I'm going to fudge a little bit. The story I'm going to tell is a little bit outside the NCA. It's actually in the Colorado National Monument. But if you hike back far enough into Codell's Canyon, you've maybe come across an old mine that was left, and the mine was used by a man by the name of John A. Codell. At the bottom, at the base of the canyon, you can also see where he had his home. You can see some infrastructure in place that John Codell left behind. Our first account of John Codell in the area comes in 1905. You can see this out of the Grand Junction News, basically a city directory. I love showing where we find history, not just telling you stories, but also how we know the history that we talk about. And so searching for old directories is a great way to find when somebody first enters an area. This is the first account of John Codell in the area that I could find. But we also have him listed in the 1920 US Census. And I know this is really hard to read small font for you to see on your screen, but some of the highlights are that in 1920, he was about 57 years old, meaning he was born about 1863. So born during the Civil War in Pennsylvania. We also know that his father's birthplace and his mother's birthplace were in France. So both of his parents immigrated to the United States from France. He was 57, yet his marital status was listed as widowed. So he survived his wife. But what's really interesting about this census, if you look right here, you can see for occupation, it's listed as mining. And for industry, it says gold mining. And he is also listed as living in Fruita. So we know that by 1920, Codell is considering himself a gold miner. And so he was probably working on that mine just up Codell Canyon by 1920. We know it was probably even earlier than that because we have a newspaper account from 1919 here. This is from the Daily Sentinel. This is a really fun article. It says, this is about the Campfire Girls. It says the Campfire Girls have disclosed their joys and pleasures on their recent outing. First, they winded their way to Fruita, as the shades of night were falling fast and pitched their tents. The next day, they climbed to the top of the mountain, returned for dinner, then visited Codell's Canyon, and were conveyed through the mine, which Mr. Codell has located in the canyon which bears his name. then supper and afterwards home, which they reached at a rather late hour, tired but happy. So again, we can see that Codell is not just mining at this point, but he's also showing it off. This is another great early description of Codell's mine from 1920. It says, if Joseph Codell has struck rich ore in his mines across the river from Fruita and Codell Canyon, it is a case of where perseverance and absolute faith in an undertaking has won its award. Mr. Codell has zealously guarded his interest for years, and when all others believed that he was the victim of a pipe dream, he insisted that mineral lay in those hills and that he was on the right track. Here's hoping he is not disappointed in it. They made an allusion in their kind of a passing remark about how persistent he was. What was the word that they used about how zealously guarded he was about his mine? And that's what we see in a lot of oral histories discussing Codell. It sounds like not only did Codell have his little house set up at the bottom, but it sounds like he literally was defending this area. We have a lot of stories of him shooting at people that tried venturing farther up Codell Canyon. Now, the story of Codell takes a rather dark and sad turn. This is from the Daily Sentinel in 1922. John Codell, resident of the Fruita district, has been found of unsound mind and is to be taken to the state asylum. The next U.S. Census in 1930 is from Pueblo, Colorado, from the Colorado State Hospital, and we see John Codell listed as an inmate there. John Codell has the same listing in the 1940 U.S. Census, and in 1944, on June 15th, John Codell passed away and is buried in Pueblo today. So next time you go venture back into that area, just remember the John Codell that the canyon's named after. And that's another important point that I like to bring up with history, is that all of our place names aren't just random names on a map. There's people, there's stories, there's legends, there's ideas, all behind the different place names that we have in the NCAs. Moving to our next national conservation area, this of course is the Dominquez-Escalante National Conservation Area, stretching all the way essentially from Westwater almost down to Delta, and then quite a bit to the southwest from there. There are two really distinct canyons. There are numerous canyons, of course, but the two most distinct are Dominick Canyon, which runs here, and Escalon Canyon, which runs a little bit farther south. But running in between the two canyons is the Gunnison River, which passes here. The Gunnison River is critical because it's a natural travel corridor, and that is the route that the railroad in 1882 decided to take. This is an early map of the area. I'm not sure I have the dates handy on when this was created. I can look that up for you later on. But these are beautiful maps made by the General Land Office, and this is all to help with homesteading efforts. You can't homestead on land unless you can describe and point to where that land is on a map. So sending out survey crews to actually say, here are the ranges and sections and townships is critical. But you can see on here the Gunnison River, it's a nice ribbon, it's nice winding way through the canyons country. And you can see the railroad, the old Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad coming through here. This is Dominick Canyon, which we'll talk about next. You can also see Bridgeport. I'm sure many of you have hiked in Bridgeport. So I'll tell you a couple of quick stories about Bridgeport in the Dominick Canyon area, then we'll move down to Escalon Canyon. I mentioned the railroad was just absolutely critical. Again, the railroad came to the area in 1882, working its way from the south, coming from Gunnison, and then you can see, here we go. Here we go. You can see it coming from this area up from the south. You can see the actual stop of Dominguez, and then a little bit farther up at Bridgeport. And so here's Bridgeport. I know many of you have hiked that area. You've parked and you've walked along the railroad, and you've actually crossed basically right here. Bridgeport was a railroad siding probably housed some railroad workers. In 1906, a bridge was moved from Quebec, and this is the bridge that's there today. Not the one that you cross over, fortunately, but this was the bridge across the river that was moved. That again, it's still fascinating to still see that. It's fascinating to see people here, and again, we need to remember that these areas were home to people for a long time. Sadly, we can find many articles about drownings and accidents near Bridgeport. It was a very remote, hard place for sure. But we can also see some evidence of the range wars taking place in the Bridgeport Dominguez area. This is a newspaper article from March 27th, 1916. And it says that Howard Lathrop arrived here from Montrose on Saturday, called here by information that a repetition of the attack made on his herd of sheep about 2 weeks ago had occurred early that morning. Ed Brown and some of the Mexican herders made a stand against the attackers. Mr. Brown shot one of the horses from under the rider. Sheriff Mac A. Davis and County Sheriff Cash Sampson, remember that name, were notified of the crime by Mr. Lathrop, and they accompanied him to the scene of the shooting. About 150 sheep were killed and a number wounded. The scene of the killing was between Bridgeport and Dominguez, almost on the Delta and Mesa County line. As that newspaper article mentioned, this was the second raid within 2 weeks in this area. In March of 1916, the Lathrop brothers moved their sheep via the train. They unloaded at Dominguez and they were headed toward Leonard Basin. The sheep herders had planned to move their sheep across the frozen river, but the ice had already melted by the time they got there. And Lathrop was forced to make camp essentially in the middle of what was then cattle country. Again, this is before formal permits were done, and so there was kind of gentleman agreements as far as where the sheep could be and where the cattle could be, and Lathrop found himself in the wrong place. His account, Howard Lanthrop's account, is that he went to get materials to make a ferry or to make a bridge, and he left, and at that night, a group of night raiders rode into his herd of over 2,000 sheep, wounding about 200. And then again, about 2 weeks later, another 150 were wounded. There is quite a bit of controversy to this story. We hear two different sides to the story, of course. The Lanthrops claim that when they investigated the site, they found 300 shells from rifles at the scene. They found horse tracks leading to a cabin, but then the shoes were removed to make it difficult to tell whose horse was whose. And they also found a Stetson hat with the marking Delta Merchant on it that family ended up keeping for quite a while. This story is going to be kind of important here in just a little bit once we move down to Escalante. But a lot of the story we're going to talk about at Escalante gets its start here at this March 1916 incident where the Lanthrops' sheep were attacked by, quote, night raiders. Some more kind of modern history for you. And Annie, you mentioned you liked a good murder story. Jumping ahead in time, Bridgeport also has a sad element in our local history for a kind of questionable, I don't know if we can quite say unsolved murder, but a murder or a series of murders that has certainly created a lot of questions, more questions than answers. On August 22nd, 1975, Patricia Botham and her neighbors Linda Miracle, no relation that I know of, and Linda's two sons, Chad, age 3, and Troy, age 5, were missing from their Grand Junction homes. Witnesses claim that they heard shots and that they claim that they saw a person taking a large bundle from the Miracle residence around 1 a.m. on the morning of August 23rd. The day before, August 25th, or August 22nd, excuse me, Kenneth Botham, the husband of Patricia Botham, left in the evening hours of August 22nd for a weekend trip to the San Juans to do some photography. Kenneth checked in at the Poly Motel and Campground in Ouray. That's well established. He spent the night there, and he claims that he left the following afternoon because the weather was too poor in Ouray to get the wilderness photography shots that he wanted. He claims that he arrived back in Grand Junction on August 23rd, 1975, and there is no sign of his wife, but his two children were there. Police searched for the wife, Patricia, and they discovered at that time that the next door neighbor, Linda Miracle, and her sons were missing. There was no signs of forced entry, no signs of violence, and the police originally theorized that Patricia and Linda's children all left together, but the four of them left together. But on September 28th, 1975, the body of Linda Miracle was discovered near Bridgeport in the Gunnison River by railroad crews. They claim that they smelled just a smell that was overpowering, and they traced the smell, and they found the body in the river. On September 28th, 1975, the body of Linda Miracle was discovered, as I mentioned. The bodies of Chad and Troy, her children, were found the following day on September 29th. Patricia Botham's body was discovered about a week later on October 2nd, 1975. Each body was bound with wire, and a piece of railroad iron was bound to them to make them sink to the bottom of the river. Patricia and Linda, the two adults, had died from asphyxiation by strangulation. Chad and Troy, the young children, died from a .22 caliber gunshot to the head. Keith Botham was arrested on November 8th. They found some blood in his automobile that had police curious. A trial was conducted in November of 1976, and Botham was found guilty on December 11th. The Colorado Supreme Court then ordered a new trial on grounds that they needed a more impartial venue. He was still found guilty on that second trial and is still currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. There are still some questions as far as Kenneth actually was the one that committed the crime. It sounds like an open and shut case. However, he was able to prove that he checked into the motel at 9 p.m., that he talked with some people in Ouray about 10:30 p.m. He claims that he went to bed. The motel owner said that the bed was slept in and the shower used. But the prosecution was able to establish that he still could have, even after 10:30 p.m. or 11 p.m. in Ouray, he could have driven back to Grand Junction by 11 a.m. and then drive back to Moab that morning. Linda Miracle had an estranged husband that was coming to visit that weekend, it sounds like. Plus, she had another boyfriend who was perhaps coming over that evening as well. So there's a couple of other characters to this story. Kenneth did indeed own a .22 caliber firearm, but no bullets were discovered to actually do ballistic tests. There's some other questions about the evidence as far as the wire that was used, the blood evidence. There's a couple of questions behind that. The bridge at Bridgeport, where it's theorized the bodies were thrown from, was locked behind a gate. And there had also been a prior murder attempt, a strangulation at that, on Linda Miracle's life. Coupled with that, in 1975, Grand Junction had a series of missing persons and possible murders. Grand Junction 1975, again, that'd be a talk in and of itself. Many of the murders and disappeared persons ended up having a tie to Linda Miracle or the same neighborhood as the Bothams. So there's still some controversy, still some question. There's a couple of podcasts out there right now, and there's even a book out there taking a look at this story. But again, all of this is tied to Bridgeport. Moving down past Bridgeport, we get to Dominick Canyon. Dominguez had a large copper boom. And so this first article that I have from 1900 from the Delta Independence talks about Mr. John Hampton, keep that name in mind for a second, and Pete Miller, late of Battle Lake, Wyoming, who recently purchased a copper prospect in McInnis Canyon, have opened a 6-foot vein that assays at $145 in gold and copper across the entire face. The position or the property is only 2.5 miles up the canyon from Dominguez Station, and the lucky owners are only waiting for a wagon road to be completed to begin shipping, as they have plenty of ore. So it sounds like Mr. Hampton and Miller are quite excited about their copper strike, about their mine. But then if we look at the article from less than about 6 months, 7 months later, from February of 1901, it reads, last Monday at forenoon, about 11 o'clock, while John Hampton was riding to Delta on horseback from Dominguez Canyon, he was met by 2 men on horseback about 6 miles below Delta. The men wore handkerchiefs over their faces. When they got within speaking distance of Mr. Hampton, they covered him with their revolvers and demanded that he, quote, shell out, which the miner did to the amount of $40 and some cents. Mr. Hamilton had recently sold his interest in a copper mining claim in Dominguez Canyon and was evidently known by the holdups that he had money. So kind of interesting that we can talk about both the copper mine boom in Dominguez Canyon and also how that boom also led to some savory characters coming to do a holdup. One of the most storied areas of the Dominguez-Escalante conservation area, though, is Escalon Canyon. And I am already running out of time, so I'm going to fly through this as fast as I can. But Escalon Canyon deserves a 90-minute talk by itself. One of the more popular trails in that area is the McCarty Trail. But this is a time when we have to be careful how names are spelled. McCarty with an H versus without an H. McCarty without an H harkens back to the Tom McCarty gang. We know that they would use both Sinbad Valley on the Utah-Colorado state line, but also Escalante Canyon as a hideout area. On September 7th, 1893, Tom McCarty, his brother Bill, and Bill's son Fred tried robbing the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Delta. The robbery did not go as well as planned. Tom McCarty stayed outside holding the horses while Bill and his son Fred went into the bank. The cashier there, Andrew Blatchley, sounded the alarm and was shot by Fred, leaving 9 children behind. The gang tried to flee, but as they make their way out of town, Tom is able to get out, but a former Civil War sharpshooter by the name of Ray Simpson opened fire and was able to hit Bill McCarthy. When his son Fred saw what happened, he turned around, fired back at least 3 shots. All of those missed, and was then shot by Simpson as well. This is the article, the newspaper, murder 3 robbers, attempt a horrible deed. You can see photos of Fred and Tom, a sketch of Tom. But this next photo is going to be a little grisly, and this is actually the photo of the 2 father and son. So this is Bill over here on the left. They had to keep his skull together by using his hat to hold everything in place for this photo. And his son Fred, they were then quickly buried there in the same grave just outside of Delta. Now, to bring up the story 1, because we do know that the gang would use that Escalante Canyon as a hideout. But again, there's also a McCarty Trail, but keep note that that trail name is spelled with an H. And the name of a homesteader in that area was McCarty with an H. And oftentimes the 2 names get mixed up in local lore. So always check the spelling of names before you get too excited about a connection. Again, we could talk about Escalante Canyon all evening. I'm going to take my last 5 minutes before questions to tell you the most popular story from Escalante Canyon. But honestly, if you are curious about Escalante Canyon, if you have ever been into that area, highly encourage that you do. You need to have this book. You need to read Red Hole in Time by Marshall. This was published in 1988, and it is the definitive guide to Escalante Canyon. Go buy it. Fascinating stories. There's the story of Emma Rothenbeck, who was lured to the canyon because she read a note that she found while boxing peaches of a bachelor looking for a lover. There's the story, the account of Bud Huffington, who claimed that Escalante Canyon, he says that that canyon is nothing but a grave without a lid. There's the tragic story of lovely Mao, who left the canyon to marry a man only to try to commit suicide at a Placerville saloon. There are just so many great stories that Marshall goes through. And again, I can't do that justice. I encourage you to go read those stories on your own because they are just simply well done. She's a fascinating author and really weaves stories together, oral traditions together, and just accounts of the land together. But by far the most popular story that she writes about and that many have written about is the clash between Ben Lowe and Cash Sampson. Here's a couple of photographs of Ben Lowe. He was married. He had 3 daughters and 2 sons. He's known as being an excellent horseman, and there's a balanced rock in Escalante Canyon that it's claimed that Ben Lowe would jump his horse across the gap and stand on top of this balanced rock. They actually call that Lowe Rock. He was known for having quite a temper, and he ran into problems with the law as early as 1904 and was suspected to have been involved with cattle rustling. It also appears that he was involved with that story that I told you about the raid on the sheep, the Lathrop story. It appears that maybe Ben Lowe was one of the chief characters in that, or at least there was a big suspicion that he was. Again, that was in March of 1916. The counter to Ben Lowe, well, Ben Lowe is sometimes viewed as this Robin Hood character of Escalante Canyon. The upstanding, law-abiding lawman was Cash Sampson. He was formerly the Delta County Sheriff, and if you'll remember, he's listed in that Lathrop newspaper article that I mentioned to you. He resigned as Sheriff of Delta County in 1914 to become a brand inspector in the area, and it was his duty to go out and inspect some of these stories and tales. He bought a ranch along Escalante Canyon in 1916. He was a bachelor, but extremely respected and well-liked, and was known as being an outstanding lawman. However, Ben Lowe, Cash Sampson didn't always see eye to eye. And as Cash Sampson, as much as he maybe had sympathies toward the ranchers, he was also there to uphold the law. And so he starts investigating the Lathrop incident. And it's believed that Cash Sampson might have been on his way to arrest Ben Lowe in 1917. In June 9 of 1917, things come to a head. Both Ben Lowe and Cash Sampson meet. They just happen to stumble upon the J.W. Musser Ranch around lunchtime. They shared lunch together. Ben Lowe was there with his 2 sons, Robert, age 11, and William, age 9. And eventually Lowe and Sons leave lunch about 15 minutes ahead of Cash Sampson. Sampson's able to catch up, and what happens next is the canyon lore, is the canyon history. But as best as we can tell, what happens on that fateful day is Lowe tells his sons to go ahead and ride ahead, that he needs to talk with Sampson. So the 2 boys leave, they're at least out of view. It appears, looking at evidence from the time, that Sampson and Lowe ride together and maybe talk a bit. And then what is theorized is that Lowe then takes out his revolver and fires first, missing Cash Sampson. Sampson then fires his pistol at Ben Lowe. Lowe tries to hide behind his horse. He's well known for being an excellent horseman, and he's known for doing this move where he kind of goes down beneath the horse's head to get a clean shot off. And as he's in the middle of doing that, it appears that Sampson takes his pistol and is able to fire and hit Lowe, and the bullet passes through his back, hits his lung and his heart. Lowe then falls to the ground, didn't die right away. And instead, as Cash Sampson approaches on his horse, Lowe is able to take his pistol and he's able to fire twice. The first hitting Cash Sampson in the head, the second, probably after Sampson dies, hitting him in the leg. The two boys hear the gunshots, the four gunshots. They come back. Their father is still alive, but just for a quick minute, the boys then go back to the muscle range to call for help. So what exactly happened during that shooting is all just based off of what people were able to find as far as evidence left behind at the time, gathering together possible motives. Again, the most common theory is that Sampson was probably about to arrest Ben Lowe for his involvement in the range war. It's also rumored that Sampson was going to testify in a grand jury of Lowe's involvement in the Lanthorpe incident. J.D. Dillard wrote a letter to the Daily Sentinel in 1973, and he believes that, and what's interesting is that J.D. Dillard was the nephew of Cash Sampson, but married one of Ben Lowe's daughters. So he has kin on both sides. And he believes that Sampson was planning to arrest Lowe in the sheep killing, even though Sampson was generally sympathetic toward cattlemen. It's a fascinating account. It's one of those accounts that nobody was actually there to see what happened, so we have to go off of accounts from the time, but it also is, again, one of the storied incidences to happen in Escalon Canyon. As you travel further down, you come across the homestead of Captain H.A. Smith. I'm sure many of you have been to Captain Smith's cabin. Just wanted to mention him in passing really quick, another Civil War veteran born in 1844 and was fascinated with flint knapping at a young age. He went on to learn how to carve headstones, tombstones, and he would finish his life in Escalante doing just that. He planned on probably staying in the canyon the rest of his life, but he passed away at the age of 92 while visiting family in California, and he's buried there. The final thing to talk about, since we're already a couple minutes over before we even get to questions, is kind of what I'm working on next. So those are some great stories that talk about some of the character of our two NCAs. But I also want to talk about one of the buildings that I get the most questions about. This is in the Dominquez-Escalante National Conservation Area. If you have been to one of the scenic overlooks, you have peered right down at it. It's a two-story building on a very prominent curve in the river. If you floated down from Escalante to Bridgeport, you've seen it there on the river left. I've had many questions as far as what this building is or was, and I've heard many accounts. While I'm still working on it, I have been able to see that this is that area, that plot of land, that corner of this river bend was homesteaded by John Leritter, kind of a hard name to say, Lehrritter. The earliest homestead record is from October 5th, 1911. But I also came across this record where he is putting in a ditch. The ditch was to be 1 foot in depth, 3 foot in width, and at the top and 2 feet at the bottom for a distance of 6,100 feet with a capacity of 3.8 cubic feet for an estimated cost of $1,000. This ditch was surveyed in 1908. So in 1908, he had this ditch surveyed. He ended up getting the homestead for the land in 1911. Now, John would go on to have quite a distinguished career in Colorado history. He moved to the Gunnison area, and he was actually a member of the Colorado Senate. And there he helped propose several landmark bills that have affected Western Colorado. One was the formation of the college in Gunnison, and the other was the formation of the State Historic Society. So again, this is some freshly baked history for you that I'm still working out. but I know many people have asked and have questions about that building. So I'm doing what I can to research it now, and hopefully I'll be able to reach back out soon with more info. So that about does it for me. As you can see, each of those stories deserve a whole talk in and of themselves. We kind of flew through a lot of that, but I'm happy to take any questions. And even off of Zoom, if you want to shoot me a line, I'm happy to share resources and answer what I can. But hopefully this gives you some characters and stories for what make our NCAs some really truly wild places. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Zeb. You actually did, I think, answer the one question I've gotten so far, which was about that large two-story building just up the mouth of Dominguez Canyon.
And there it is. And again, that's something that this is like really fresh baked history. So I'm still trying to narrow some more down. Homestead records are a decent tool. They can at least tell you who got the patent on the land. That doesn't mean they were the first in that area. Oftentimes you'll have an area that somebody settled on before they actually went through the effort of getting a homestead patent on it. So it doesn't necessarily establish who was first in an area, and it certainly doesn't establish who was last. It does give you a thread to work off of though. So we can start tracing that land ownership from John on down and start piecing together the history from there.
Yeah. Well, everyone, feel free to ask more questions in the chat. We can take just another couple minutes to answer those if anyone does have questions. That was definitely some new information to me, though, in your talk, Zeb. You know, Escalante Canyon is certainly just, I think, where a lot of attention goes with some of these wild stories. And, you know, being able to see the carving of Ben Lowe's name that Captain Smith did, that's always a good, you know, landmark to point out to people when you are in Escalante Canyon.
Absolutely. And you know, that's kind of my main point for doing programming like this, is that if you just go by that name, it's just a name carved. And please don't carve on the canyon walls, right? We'll get that out of the way.
Yeah.
But when you actually start putting stories behind those names, and you know, Ben Lowe's a real popular one, a real easy one to research, but I absolutely love going to Captain Smith's cabin, and you can see several other names from the time period. Sadly, you see a lot of graffiti, but you see a lot of names that were done contemporaneous to when Captain Smith was there, and you just begin to wonder, well, what's this person's story? What's that person's story? And I'll go out there and I'll see a family name and go, oh, I've seen that name somewhere else, and that just makes it all come together.
So we just got a comment in the chat saying that on river maps, the two-story building is called the section house, as if it was related to the railroad. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've seen that before, and that was kind of one of my first thoughts too. The only, and I've established the beginning of the homestead claim there and where the ditch comes from. I'm not yet ready to say if it was or was not used by the railroad, right? So that could be farther in the building's history than what I've been able to look at. My biggest worry about that, though, is that it's on the opposite bank of the railroad, right? So you'd have that logistics of crossing the river there if it was used by the railroad. Again, I'm not saying it never was or wasn't. I just haven't had the chance to research that yet. It is in between other stations, though. So Bridgeport is really not very far away at all. And we do know that that had section houses that were used by the railroad. So again, I'm not in a position right now where I can say definitively one way or the other. Just kind of, I am a little skeptical on initial read through, just with it being on the opposite side of the river from the railroad. Solvable, but you also have a section house, the railroad section, just a little bit further downriver there at Bridgeport, or a little bit farther upriver, Dominguez itself. So or I guess probably a huff up there. But again, I'll look into it. It's something that at least now we have a foothold to go off of, and hopefully soon I'll be able to report back more on that to you.
Great. Yeah, that's it's so nice that, you know, there's still these questions that you're able to ask and look into.
You'll never know the answer to every question out there, which is what I love, right? There's always another structure to look at. I know when I go into Escalante, there are so many building ruins and old foundations that you just can't help but wonder what each one was used by. And you know that each one is a story, you know that each one housed somebody. And those people had, you know, hopes and dreams and thoughts and worries and laughed and joked just like you and I do today. And all that's left is this ruin. And we can actually tie in a name, start tying in a story, start making that more than just a name, but a person. It definitely improves things. And so that's also where I need to put in the plug. When you see things like this, please visit with respect, please visit carefully. Remember that everything that you find there could help archaeologists and historians actually identify what that story is. So please leave on the tracks, take a look at pictures.
Absolutely. With that, Zeb, we got a question. Where can we find your upcoming information about this house?
Well, I'm not sure yet. So I came across the homestead record actually about a year and a half ago. Came across the ditch record about a year ago. Kind of got into a little kick of actually researching the gentleman, which is where I found out the connections to the State Historic Society. Then that's the fun part about studying this history is there's always another rabbit hole to go down. What I need to do next is establish, okay, what happened after John Lathrop left the area, who took care of the home? And then it would be nice to figure out, when did that property get absorbed by the Bureau of Land Management? It's now public land. So when did that land exchange take place? And those are some of the clues that'll help us flesh out that story. When will I be done with that? I have no idea. The number of half or quarter researched things that I'm working on right now is very long. One of the challenges is you start working on a project like this and you get a little ways in, but then the new bright shiny one that is another rabbit hole comes up and you start getting little ways into that. So just need to bog down and actually get it finished up. But maybe that'll make a good CCA newsletter article once I'm able to get it figured out.
That would be great.
And if anyone out there, I mean, we got to crowdsource this stuff too, right? If anyone out there has other ideas, other thoughts, if you go, hey, I actually know this, my grandfather knew the person that lived there, or, you know, hey, I know this newspaper article, please let us know. One person working alone doesn't get very far. So if anyone out there has any information or any thoughts, boy, I'd love to hear it, because one person can't know it all, but all of us working together might be able to figure it out.
Absolutely. Well, if we don't have any more questions coming up in the chat, I'm going to just go ahead and say thank you so much for speaking with us all tonight. I think we all learned a lot. And, you know, CCA always appreciates everything you do to help, you know, educate folks about our national conservation areas. I will just let everyone know, if you haven't signed up already, we do have our last lecture has been rescheduled for next Tuesday, same time. And for that one, we will be learning about the rare and endemic plants of the NCAs with a BLM ecologist. So with that, we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. Looking forward to hearing more stories from folks. So yeah, thank you all for joining tonight. You're going to get an email when we get this up on YouTube, probably tomorrow or later this week. And so you can always share this with friends and other folks you know who would be interested. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Zeb, for a great presentation. And thanks all for being here.
Of course. Thank you all very much. And thank you to CCA for hosting and for all that you guys do. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.